Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Joy Thomas, and I'm the President and the CEO of the Chartered Professional Accountants of Canada. And it's an honor for me to introduce our excellent closing keynote speaker of the day, Mark Carney, Governor of the Bank of England. Governor Carney has been called a rock star of finance, and as one Globe and Mail columnist recently noted, he's not shy about telling governments what they should or shouldn't do. No doubt about it, when Governor Carney speaks, people listen. One topic where CPA Canada and the Governor have a strong common interest is climate change. Governor Carney is the chair of the Financial Stability Board, which at the request of the G20 was asked to create the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Last year, the task force recommended a set of voluntary disclosures that would help establish greater reporting consistency on climate change issues. Today, however, Governor Carney is here to address another topic of concern, the future of work. In the past, he has spoken out on the importance of lifelong learning, and as a leader in a profession, I can vouch for the value of continuous learning and of upskilling as we navigate so much change. As Governor of the Bank of England since 2013, Mark Carney is using his expertise to help the UK navigate its own set of unique economic challenges. And as we know, prior to that appointment, he served as the Governor of the Bank of Canada from 2008 to 2013, following a career he had in international finance, as well as at the Department of Finance Canada. We're so pleased to have the opportunity to hear from the Governor today. His global insights on the future of work from an international and a historical context will offer valuable input on how Canada can go the distance and generate long-term economic sustainability. Ladies and gentlemen, Mark Carney.
Thank you very much, Joy. I'm glad I'm amongst at least some friends, because there's no way I'm going to live up to that introduction. I'm going to amble through some thoughts about the future of work from a, not surprisingly, largely UK perspective. Try to globalize it a bit, and put forward some tentative policy responses. I won't be telling governments what they should do. For those of you watching back in the United Kingdom, I will just merely be making very modest, tentative suggestions as by way of continuing the conversation and continuing the excellent conversation. We just had an excellent conversation. I caught a bit of true practitioners in this area. So now you're going to get the central bank version of it. So let me step back first. I'm going to start with a bit of a historical context, what we're dealing with. We have seen over the course of the last quarter century a series of profound disruptions in the way we work, trade, consume, and live. And all of that has meant huge progress around the world. 1 billion people lifted out of poverty. Almost 4 billion now have access to the sum of human knowledge at the click of a virtual button. Global life expectancy is up by 2 decades. But to many citizens in advanced economies, including this one, certainly in the UK, such measures of aggregate progress bear little relationship to their everyday experience. And rather than a new golden era, this era of globalization and technological change are associated with low wages, insecure employment, and striking inequalities. And from a UK perspective, this is the first decade of lost real incomes, those are 10-year averages of real incomes, since the middle of the 19th century. So you have that, you have the wake of a global financial crisis, or at least a financial crisis in the UK, and in the midst of a technological revolution. So if you substitute platforms for textile mills, machine learning for the steam engine, Twitter for the telegraph, you have exactly the same dynamics as existed 150 years ago, and that's what was happening 150 years ago. Karl Marx was scribbling the Communist Manifesto in the reading room of the British libraries. And certainly, today's some of the fractures today are the product of common drivers. Now, the challenge is that alongside great benefits, any large period of technological change mercilessly destroys jobs and livelihoods, and therefore identities. And that was true from the move from cottage industry and agriculture to manufacturing, from the development of the production line out of the original manufacturing and displacement of manufacturing by the services economy. And the question that I want to address today is whether this is about to happen again, but on a much greater scale and at a faster pace through machine learning and global sourcing. By the way, that is an electron exploding. I learned that about 5 minutes ago, but I thought it looked cool, so we should put it up. And then I thought maybe someone's going to ask, so now you know. You got full disclosure. Okay, so to start to bring this into context, now some economists, and there are certainly more than a few economists in the room, wonder what's all the fuss about, and they correctly point out that there's been little evidence over the long term of technological unemployment, the sort of fear that this new technology will displace and that the employment share will go down. And so the top line there is just the employment share in the UK since the late 1700s. The much more dramatic line is unemployment. But in both cases, we're seeing the employment share in the UK today and the unemployment rate at 4.3%. 4.3%, I'm going to repeat for those of you still watching in the UK, you're welcome, is at historic highs for employment and historic lows for unemployment. The problem is that the transitions, or the challenge is that the transitions from one state to another takes time. And workers generally cannot, because obviously workers can't generally move seamlessly from one type of job into another in which they can be as productive. So the benefits from a worker's perspective of the first industrial revolution, which began in the latter half of the 18th century, were not felt fully in productivity and wages until the second half of the 19th. And if you see on that chart, there's what's known euphemistically as the Engels pause, the other half of Marx and Engels, which is that period where the real wage is flat for an uncomfortably long period after productivity really surges. And we'll come back to that. So what economists euphemistically call frictions can lead to depressed local or national labor markets and sharply increase inequality. Now, I'm going to try to set up a bit of a framework. Those are minions, I think, on the left. I didn't check that beforehand, but that's what it looks like. But a framework to think about how technological change affects the labor market. And in effect, it's the sum of three, I'm simplifying obviously, but three major effects. Destruction, productivity, and creation, that's what I'll call them. And the destruction effect is the focus of most alarmist accounts, which is the replacement of labor by technology, reducing labor demand, reducing wages, and employment. Now, less commonly acknowledged at the same time as there's a destruction effect is there is an impact on aggregate demand, a positive impact from the new technologies. And this is an analog of the classic sort of Say's law, which is supply creates its own demand. Technology makes those in work that can use the technology, and that's not everybody, but those who can, more productive. It boosts their wages, and it certainly also increases the returns to those who own capital, and that greater income, whether by capital or labor, boosts aggregate demand and leans against, doesn't fully counteract, but leans against the destruction effect. It doesn't fully counteract, not least because of job polarization, and I'll come back to that. As a consequence, over the medium term, technological change tends to reduce the labor share of income, but historically not permanently. And that's because of the creation effect, which is that eventually there are new tasks for labor using the new technology that are created and other technologies that ultimately counterbalance the displacement effects. Okay, that's all context, the past and conceptual. And the bigger question is, could it be different this time? The first point to make is thus far, I think, as we all know, each of those three previous industrial revolutions increased the relative importance of cognitive tasks relative to non-cognitive ones. In other words, since their inception, machines have substituted for human hands, not their heads, or our heads, and I'll include myself in the human race. Workers have been able to upskill and take up newly created sets of cognitive higher value tasks beyond the cognitive abilities of machines. Of course, the issue is that the rapid improvements in computing power, the increased availability of big data, advances in artificial intelligence, and machine learning may mean that the new job creation might, for an uncomfortably long period of time, not increase overall employment. That is, the destruction effect may outweigh the combined impacts of the productivity and creation effects, and particularly if automation substantially shifts the boundary between capital and labor. Now, this dynamic could substantially increase inequality for several reasons. Most fundamentally, the more technology substitutes for labor rather than complements it, the more gains will accrue to capital over labor. And an unequal distribution of capital means that automatically, by construction, this will push up inequality. More subtly, if education is unable to keep up with the pace of changing demand for skills, what was the previous panel was just discussing at the end, those who already have the skills themselves, those who have the skills going in, will get an ever higher premium. And job polarization will increase the supply of those competing for lower skilled jobs. People will be overskilled for jobs, but just clear supply demand in the barista category, if you will, keeps that wage down. I hope no one's offended. Well, I guess if you're a barista, you're offended by that, but I'm sorry. I didn't come up with that. That would be my last ad lib of the event. The greater global. Okay, and then the other element, greater global interconnectedness exacerbates these dynamics. And if this world of surplus labor comes to pass, Marx and Engels may again become relevant. So I gave some historical context, a conceptual framework, talked a bit about the nature of the challenge, and now I want to turn to the evidence. Thus far, empirical work shows that increased automation has been positive for employment in aggregate. So this hasn't come to pass. There have been substantial compositional changes, though, and the implication for wages have been less clear. And if you see, it's a slightly busy chart, but the key thing to take is anything in red are the most recent wage prints relative to unemployment, and if those are students of economics, that is a wage Phillips curve in effect, and they have shifted down. So labor markets are have not been as tight, or tight labor markets have not had the product of having as big an impact on wages as they had in the past in, for example, the US and the UK. Now, we at the Bank of England think that the softness of wage growth following the financial crisis can be largely explained by the combination of underemployment and weak productivity. But it's also possible that this may reflect the early consequences of the deeper process of technological change with more part-time, flexible work and delayed productivity benefits due to two things. One, not enough people having the requisite skills to take advantage of the productivity or the technologies, or as yet insufficient business process reengineering to realize the full benefits of automation. And the big picture globally is that the labor share is going down quite sharply, and the relative price of capital, the boundary between capital and labor, has also fallen quite significantly. And in fact, the IMF finds that technological progress during the third industrial revolution, in other words, computer age, up until the early start of this century, has been the biggest contributor to this decline, so much bigger than free trade, for example. Another commercial for the UK. One country stands alone. Look at that. Stable, but very high. So high to begin with. So the big increase in inequality in the UK following the Thatcher reforms, and it's been relatively stable at that level. And there's not great explanations for why this effect hasn't come to the same degree. There is but big picture, labor share coming down, and big picture as well, substantial evidence of job polarization. Much more job growth at the lower skill end, and the higher skilled end, the middle being hollowed out, and the consequence that the returns to education, the relative returns to education are quite striking across the board. How big of an effect is this? What's the evidence on scale? Here it gets much more murky. There are a huge range of estimates of the number of jobs with tasks at risk, and that's the key, that everything there is important. So it's not so much full jobs disappearing, but it's jobs that have a significant number of tasks that can be substituted. You see ranges from around 9% to 1 in 2 jobs from a variety of studies. I think our view, this is on the right-hand side, is most recent work out of the OECD with which we would, for what it's worth, be more sympathetic to and think sort of 10% of jobs in Canada and the UK. Substantial, and I'll show you later that it's potentially larger than what's happened previously. One of the things to recognize about all these estimates, or virtually all these estimates, less so on the right-hand side, is that they've all looked at technological feasibility and not married that with economic feasibility. So the example, a simple example would be it's feasible to have a machine pour your drink in a bar, but it's actually at this stage it's not more economic, and of course you lose the value add of having someone to tell your troubles to while you're there, which is why you go to the bar. At some point that boundary will shift, but it hasn't been taken into account, so it's more speculative, some of those higher estimates. So to summarize thus far, if the fourth industrial revolution is the same as the previous three, eventually it should be labor augmenting, boosting both productivity and wages and creating new jobs in the long run. But in the interim, it looks like, even at those lower end of those range of estimates, that this could be bigger than the previous waves in terms of numbers affected, and certainly much more rapid. This is a crude illustration of that, but this is just technology adoption, time on the x-axis, and the various months to adoption on the y. And you see that you see what you know, which is new technologies are adopted much more rapidly now. And just to map this into, is this time it's faster, how quickly do we lose the heads while gaining the hearts and hands jobs. It is the case as well, I don't have a slide for this, but there is a disconnect, at least in expectations. We have surveys of citizens where over 90% of citizens don't think that their jobs will be affected by automation, whereas almost similar percentages of CEO think that exact opposite in terms of material number of jobs being affected, and that this process is about to accelerate. Okay, policy, since this is the public policy forum. So what has been done, and what has been done in the past to cushion the blow? And in the past, public, private, and third-party institutions have helped shrink the duration, impact, and cost of transition, but it's definitely been a learning process. Enabling institutions, incredibly important, obviously, and just the gradual legging out from primary to secondary to tertiary institutions as you go through universality across those, or virtual universality across those institutions as you go through the various revolutions. In terms of insurance institutions, in the Industrial Revolution, there wasn't a welfare state in the UK. The incentives, incentives were really wholly negative, going to the poorhouse, at least trying to avoid going to the poorhouse. And so benevolence was socialized by individuals with friendly societies and cooperatives to support colleagues who fell on hard times. By the end of the second industrial revolutions, there begins to be some support through minimum wage and greater unionization, and in terms of the insurance institution in the UK, universal health care, unemployment insurance, and pensions all come in the interwar years. And obviously, in labor market institutions, hugely important, trade union in the UK, second, and fading a bit into the third. And then finally, in terms of business or employers, it's been a bit of a mixed bag. There have been certainly a subset of employers who have taken responsibility to help create an environment where employees can thrive, from charitable support, true benevolence in the first industrial revolution in the UK at least, to the Ford era of self-interested paternalism in between, to you could term Googleplex as a self-contained community age of today. But often this has been reactive. Often it's been in reaction to mounting pressure. And one thing that I'm going to suggest is changing, not because of the fourth industrial revolution, but just broader societal norms, is that the concept of social license and increased recognition of purpose-driven businesses have meant that some businesses a bigger proportion of businesses are likely to be more anticipatory about this revolution. I'll try to justify that in a moment. Okay. And this moment is coming because the question is what could be done, not should be done, note, what could be done, what might be done. And I think the first thing is get a grip on the scale of the problem, assess and address the skills gap. And everyone can contribute to this. It goes to granular reviews by firms of the mismatches between their current talent pool and their future needs. Estimates by the creators of these general purpose technologies of the breadth of their potential applications, and reporting and aggregation by public institutions of these trends in the labor market. The skills required in the future, as you might have gathered with my sort of nomenclature of heads, hands, and hearts, may be much broader than STEM, and may involve category shifts to more non-cognitive skills and attributes. Said differently, the net result could be a decline in the demand for heads, cognitive tasks, except at the very highest end, which is applying expertise and managing others, but an increase in demand for hands, think bespoke products and services, experiences with hearts and leisure. So the higher paying jobs of the future may be better measured by EQ, or the skills related to them measured by EQ rather than IQ, and tasks which create as much social as financial value, drawing on a range of non-cognitive skills. Now, the next aspect, so after assessing the skills gap, looking at what should be done on the policy side, I've put in 3 buckets: reducing frictions to applying the new technologies. They're coming, let's get them applied, and let's look how do we deepen the productivity and creation effects. I'm not going to wade into redistribution or social safety nets for, I hope, obvious reasons, and focus more on the creation side. But I think we do need to think about adapting virtually all aspects of what I'm calling here the market ecosystem. But as you see, I'm just going to go through that taxonomy of business, of enabling institutions, labor market institutions, and then finally finish with finance. So in terms of business, repeating myself slightly, but identifying the skills mismatches and driving and developing an anticipatory talent management strategy, by which I mean figure out what are the skills that you're going to need 5-10 years out, and kind of report that and be part of the system that supplies it. Obviously, training will be incredibly important. There will be distinctions, if this moves rapidly, between training for retention and training for return to the workforce. And it's an off-cited example, but it's not a bad one. In fact, it's a good one of what AT&T has been doing, which is assessing their workforce a few years ago and realizing that their assessment is 100,000 of their employees are in jobs that won't exist in the next decade, and investing $1 billion in retraining those workers, a lot of whom are being retrained to return to the workforce, to leave AT&T, but taking a much more comprehensive approach. And I mentioned general purpose technology providers and their responsibility to explore how their products are going to be applied in ways that can maximize job creation or maximize broader social benefits. And I'll use the example in the UK of DeepMind, which is one of the leading artificial intelligence developers who spend a substantial proportion of their research budget on debating their ethical responsibilities and have a social research unit to help them put those ethics into practice and really help society think about anticipating the impact of their innovations. On the labor market side, I better speed up or Ed's not going to be able to ask any questions. So this is really important, but I'm not going to talk about any of it. The key thing, I would point you to the Taylor Review. Some of you will have read it, which looks into the question of a whole new class of workers. Think people who work on platforms in the so-called gig economy. What are their rights? What's the right? How do you integrate them with the social safety net? To what extent is their data portable? Are their reputations portable? Are their benefits portable? And how well can we equalize the incentives between human capital investment and traditional capital investment? On enabling institutions, kind of punchline here is around, so if you just play out the sequence, primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary education, institutionalizing mid-career education. So think in your late 30s, early 40s, you will be going back to school. Everyone will be going back to school, and the capacity in order to do that. And clearly this needs to be integrated with the social welfare system because hopefully in your late 30s, mid 40s, you own a property, you have a mortgage, you have a family, you have obligations, and it needs to be integrated in order to do that, but it's likely to be necessary. Well, it's possible that it will be necessary given the scale of the change. And then there are other examples which we may get to in the discussion around more traditional, well, not traditional, but flow training schemes as opposed to institutional schemes, and I give two examples there. Last word ends with finance. It's pretty important that the next phase of finance is consistent with how the economy is reorganizing. I guess it's obvious, but sometimes things that are obvious don't happen in finance. Think distributed commerce, real-time, person-to-person transactions. This is the ways businesses are very likely to reorganize, a large numbers of them. Much more effective platform-based or database finance for small, medium-sized enterprise. And for intangibles. So if you're lending against traffic and information as opposed to cash flow and hard assets, you help with this adjustment. And then the last thing, impact investing around social capital. If social investment's more important, this is something that needs to be scaled. Okay, that's my last slide. I have several things to say in conclusion, but really the only thing I should, given the time, is that this sort of optimistic view. In the end, the employment share should get back to where it was. There will be pressures to push it down, to push down the labor share, to increase inequality. We can learn from the past in order to minimize those and accelerate the adjustment. But the one swath of work which will clearly be created by the future of work is for the members of the Public Policy Forum to debate these issues and expand these ideas. So we're all going to be needed. And with that, thank you very much for having me.
So it's
you're supposed to be there, apparently.
really okay.
It was in your contract that you were there. Apparently, it was in your.
You were on my right. I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for that, and thanks for your conclusion that it's up to us to solve the problem. Thank you. Good. So I want to start. There's a lot of information there, and a lot, for people to assimilate it, in a short stop. And I think people will be thinking about it for a while. So I haven't assimilated it all either. But let's start with the idea of, fourth industrial revolution, and particularly a lot of people use the metaphor of farm to factory, and is this just farm to factory again? They say just farm to factory again, as if it wasn't a little bit upsetting the first time around. So in terms of orders of magnitude, if we unpack the things that you said, heads more than hands, the pace of change being so great, the middle class actually being hollowed out, these kinds of things. So how serious is this, if you will, the challenge in this historic framework?
Well, I think it still remains to be seen, and I think we've been working, others have been working to try to refine the numbers to go from that sort of it's 1 in 2 jobs that are going to be wiped out to, wait a minute, no, it's 30% of jobs probably seriously affected with a number of tasks to an even more refined kind of in the low teens type number. But that is bigger than, or as big is a safe thing to say, but likely bigger than what happened in the previous rounds, particularly because it's going to happen more rapidly. And so it's the speed of adjustment. If this is an adjustment over 10, 20 years, it is more disruptive because part of what's not there when you combine it with longevity, including longevity in the workforce, just sort of playing it out through to retirement as your life as a blacksmith goes away, isn't an option, and that necessitates thinking about lifelong. I mean, again, this sounds like truisms because people rightly talk about them, but necessitates being much more deliberate and comprehensive around things like lifelong learning, about training, and on training, it is difficult to get right. The world is littered with training programs that have the right objectives but don't have the right results.
So it strikes me there's another side of the equation to impact in a way, and perhaps we see it in the question of low unemployment, even with wage, a fair bit of wage stagnation, but high anxiety.
Yeah.
Low unemployment and high anxiety, and I just wonder if an Engels pause, a phrase that's new to me, the Engels pause. If there's still a tolerance for an Engels pause in a 21st century, as much tolerance for an Engels pause as there was?
Well, we may test that, and I think
we may be testing
we
it.
may be testing it, and it's intensified in those jurisdictions where the financial crisis was most acute, because the loss of the understandable skepticism that those who are trying to manage the system are on top of things is still there. That residual skepticism is there, and also the scarring that comes with the true financial crisis is still there. Psychological scarring, and this is testable and provable and seen post-depression attitudes of people who live through depression. So you have that plus that economic dynamic. So that's to flip it around to policy and not to be too dramatic about it. It just raises the stakes or makes it that much more important that we're more deliberate, more anticipatory about some of these pressures, or what needs to be done. What needs to be done.
Okay. Just by the way, because time is short, if you guys can give me some of the Slido questions early, I will maybe go to them early. In the meantime, the Growth Council, Dominic Barton was here this morning. He was talking about how disruptive it could be in Canada. Perhaps 10 million jobs disrupted. That's with tasks, as well. Maybe 10 to 12%, truly jobs that are lost that have to be retrained, concentrated in a 40 to 52-year-old area, he said. So what they're talking about in some way is that we need a middle institution, that we have kindergarten to university at the beginning of your life, we have pensions, et cetera, at the end of your life, but something in the middle. So does that make sense to you, and have you seen anything like that elsewhere in the world?
I haven't seen anything like that, but it does make sense to me in terms of something to explore. It's a big decision, creating a whole, the fourth level of institutionalized education. But given the pace and the potential scale, I do think it's worth exploring. And also, to be honest, given shifting demographics, less an issue here, but still an issue here, just less pyramidal and the numbers work a bit better.
Right.
But it needs to be, as I said, I think a few moments ago, would need to be integrated into the.
Well, you're talking about flow in a way, and I think, earlier you've talked a little bit about the UK flexible learning policy and the Singapore skills, future policy. What do we have to learn in those? Because you've looked.
Well, I think that let me branch out and take the Singapore one, which is introduced a few years ago. Every adult over 25, 500 Singapore dollars a year for training, and that does two things. One, it gives people training, money for training, but and this is the way the CEO of this fund speaks about it, is what's as important is the mindset. They are saying very clearly that your top priority should be retraining, or think about retraining on a regular basis. We're going to give you money, and actually they give on top of the money, they will subsidize up to 90%, kind of above and beyond, but they're sending a very clear signal that helps with an attitudinal shift to these changes are coming, these changes are bringing new opportunities, not these changes are going to take your job, a much more positive message, which is the, very much the positive message that can be drawn from this if we're helping people to prepare for what they want to do. I mean, on one level, again, we don't exactly know how it's going to play out, but on one level, the economy can become much more distributed, much smaller scale, much more entrepreneurial, much more bespoke. People can be more creative. They can be more empathetic. They kind of moved those areas, and that's actually a pretty exciting economy, or an interesting economy. It's a more varied economy. It's a more diverse economy if you help people get it right. So I think the training, from what I've seen on the training side, there's definitely people far more expert than I, but what works is it's got to be comprehensive. It's got to send a signal. And it can't be too directive about what is the job of the future.
Right.
So it's got to be quite
It'll be the skills
Catholic,
of the future,
if you will.
not the jobs of the future.
Yeah.
Okay. So first question that's come up, that has twice as many votes as any other at the moment, is the basic income question. Has the time come to contemplate a guaranteed annual income, a basic income? And I think I'll just leave it at that. Are we at that point that we need to have that kind of policy?
Certainly the time hasn't come for the Governor of the Bank of England to contemplate a guaranteed basic income. That is probably the safest thing I can say there.
If you say the wrong thing, it might be there for you.
Yeah, exactly.
It'll pick you up.
They might have, here's your income. None. Your income is nothing. It'll be like straight out of The Godfather. Here's my offer. Nothing. So
you're ducking.
Look, that's you might have, the sharper might have noticed that I talked a lot about insurance institutions and safety nets in the past, but not in the future, because those are that is public policy, but it's also pretty deep, fiscal and other policies, and they're live debates, and I'm just not going to wade into it.
Okay. Good. Maybe this one will be easier, because where did it go?
Is it about monetary policy?
No, it's the second one down, Mark. Because this will be in your research as well. What specific industries do you think will be most negatively impacted by this revolution?
Negatively impacted. Well, okay, I'm not trying to dodge it, but I sort of come to finance, and I think about how much is this going to affect the types of jobs in financial services, and I think pretty substantially. I think it to some extent already has. When I look back 30 years ago, what I used to do when I first went to the City of London and worked at investment bank, probably about 3/4 of what I did is now done by machine, and it is a relentless process of moving to series of decisions that are made by humans to machines. And then it's to push those human decisions to higher and higher order decisions. So it's affected, but it's, when I look back at what I did 30 years ago, it's pretty miserable data entry and sort of basic, ratio analysis, which was deemed as quite glamorous, but in retrospect is quite workaday. So affected, but maybe not so negatively, it depends on perspective. How's that?
Okay, so we're not going to get like truck drivers and manufacturers and office workers and how that falls.
Well, there are a lot of those types of jobs. If sort of routine cognitive jobs, if I can put it that way. If the Dilbert, the sort of massacre of the Dilberts. Probably I'm going to regret saying that as well, but that's a lot of the stuff that is in the process of being.
I guess years ago, Robert
out.
Reich called what were the jobs? Symbolic analysts.
So let me,
the non-symbolic analysts.
I'll give you an example. I won't name the firm, but and this is happening. A CEO of a global bank told me 2 years ago they had 330,000 employees, and that they were going to lose 130,000 in the course of the next 2-3 years, just through application of then technologies and machine learning. So those orders of magnitude are pretty substantial. Now, a lot of those employees were in the U.S. In the U.S., those workers have been able to find jobs in aggregate, but maybe not the jobs certainly not the jobs that use the skills that they have.
Okay, so I think the bottom line is, no, you're not going yet, but we're gonna switch on to a couple other topics. But I think in some ways the bottom line is that it's a transition. Transitions are awful. You get out the other side, but you darn well better get your policy right on the way, or else it becomes politically.
Well, you can put it that way. The sort of more upbeat version of this is we've been through this 3 times before, and we have a sense of what's worked in the past, learn from history, think about what's different, and adjust. The broad buckets that will need to change. And if you really buy into the scale of the change, and that's a sort of testable hypothesis, but if you buy into that, then now's the time to start preparing and building in these adjustments so that the transition isn't awful, and the transition is actually, again, to glass half full, is more empowering for the people who are transitioned. Look, there's a lot of people who are doing jobs that will be displaced, could be displaced. They're in their late 30s, early 40s, and they're not that thrilled probably to be doing their jobs. And if they were supported in a transition to something new, that actually would be positive. Yeah. But if it's just left to happen, it could have quite a large impact, including an impact on aggregate demand, because what happens is a lot of people get shifted out. The requisite skills aren't there. It takes a whole generational cycle to build them up and to discover them. And so you actually, despite making huge technological progress, you have quite weak economic progress.
Right,
and social tensions that spring from that. Yeah.
Politics don't like to wait for inept economics, in a sense, or inept policy. Okay, I want to ask you a couple of other questions while we have you as the Governor of Bank of England here. So obviously systemic risks are something that's always on your mind. Yeah. Today, so a lot of people seem to be interested in cryptocurrencies. I don't really have the same fascination with cryptocurrencies, but I keep reading about it all the time. People ask me about it. Bitcoin went up by $1,000 in 20 minutes for no apparent reason. Although there was some speculation that perhaps it has to do that it's going to get past muster under Sharia law. So maybe. Are cryptocurrencies a risk to the system?
They're not a risk to financial stability. They're too small relative to the system, and they're not connected to the system, so they're separate from the system. And that's a view the FSB reported into the G20 a few weeks ago in Argentina, first point. Second, but look, there is a huge amount of, or there has been a huge amount of illicit activity run through cryptocurrencies. So in terms of integrity of the system, or a system outside the system, they are a problem, and it will be addressed by the relevant authorities, not the Bank of England, but by the relevant authorities. And people who invest or own these currencies should be aware that there are, in a number of cases, it would appear, huge market abuse that goes on in them. So there's not market integrity. I think glass half full on cryptocurrencies, probably the best that can be said about them is that what they try to achieve, which is distributed real-time payments, is consistent with how, as I was saying earlier, a lot of the economy is being reorganized, and they point the way for institutions like the Bank of England, the Bank of Canada, who I know is thinking a lot about this, others, to evolve quite radically the existing payment system so existing currencies can fulfill, so that I can instantaneously, for example, put money from my bank account into your bank account without, the equivalent of giving you,
and what's slowing down?
Cash.
Okay.
Yeah.
Your bank account into my bank account.
There's got to be some rule. For the next, I'll do it. Look, I've just instantaneously put it in your bank account, so you'd ask me a question about British monetary policy.
Final. Would you imagine that central banks, governments will look at some point to regulate cryptocurrencies?
I think that yes is the short answer on certain aspects of it will be regulated. I think it's not clear to me there are these exchanges where you transfer your Canadian dollars for a cryptocurrency, for example, and those are in general are unregulated, and in some cases there's pretty serious abuse, or at a minimum they are very porous to cyber attack and theft, and they just do not meet the standards in many cases of other exchanges.
They may be cryptic currencies.
And so there's no reason why that should be tolerated.
Okay, let's talk about climate finance for a moment also as a risk to the system that you've been, very, very deeply involved with over the last while. Maybe we should just start, because there was an announcement today by Minister Catherine McKenna and Bill Morneau about emissaries on climate finance, and I don't need, I'm not going to ask you to explain the policies of the government of Canada, but what I'd like you to explain is why climate finance is such a big concern, and how doing something about it really relates to the real climate issue of temperature and hitting 2 degrees or not.
Well, we'll flip that around. So governments around the world decide to varying degrees to put in place policies to have a transition to a lower carbon economy, or a low carbon economy, or a zero carbon economy, depending on the ambition in the government. Those policies affect the investment decisions of businesses, the decisions of people who provide them with capital or credit, and the question is, do those providers of capital have the information they need in order to decide who's going to take advantage of the opportunities, who's going to manage the risks? So this is a risk. I'm speaking purely of risks of transition to a low carbon economy, as opposed to the manifestation of a forest fire or extreme weather event or some other manifestation of climate change. And it's the absence of that information that creates a risk in the system, first point. Second point is, and there's now a solution to that, which is this task force for climate financial disclosures, developed by the private sector on behalf of the G20, led by Michael Bloomberg. A number of Canadian institutions participated in that, and I think the emissaries of the Government of Canada are going to work with the private sector in terms of the application of that, amongst other aspects of sustainable finance. But this is the point I would make for those who aren't following this that closely, is this is becoming absolutely mainstream, and let me make that tangible. The question of managing the risks and seizing the opportunities around climate, mainstream capital markets. In December, by the December One Planet Summit in Paris, $80 trillion, or institutions controlling $80 trillion of assets signed up to support the TCFD. 8 of the 10 top asset managers in the world, the largest sovereign wealth fund, the largest pension funds, the top 20 banks in the world, and the people who control 90% of the proxy votes in capital markets. So these are mainstream issues. Canada has been, a number of major Canadian institutions are part of this process, and the question is accelerating the adoptions, the learning, the use of this to make the capital markets as effective as possible.
Okay, so I can certainly understand the risk of not understanding what's going on with my investments, pension investments and that. So I want greater transparency. I want more standardization. I want more disclosure. That's good for the system. Does it correlate in any way with what's going on in the climate and our ability to adopt policies that might avert climate disaster?
Let me say two things. It correlates with something away from climate, which is it appears to correlate with companies who think about longer-term value creation. They think about managing climate risk. So part of what you're looking at is not how much a company emits today. It's what the company's plan is for tomorrow, managing to a 2 degrees scenario. And if I could put it in, maybe finish on a broader Canadian context, which is that that transition is a long process. And during that transition, this country has a huge range, probably the most varied range of energy sources, virtually all of which will play a role during that transition. And what needs to be understood in capital markets, and arguably in the broader public, but certainly in capital markets, is who's going to play a role when do certain energy types cease to be cost effective under certain climate policies or certain scenarios. How could they be improved, and which ones are going to last for decades? And one gets a bit of sense, and I'm only newspaper smart on it, but at present that maybe hasn't fully landed how certain energy types will be important in this country for a very long period of time in a world where there is a steady progressive adjustment to a low carbon economy. And individual disclosure by companies, aggregation obviously by governments and others, PPF and others, help provide that picture. And then what you can do, sorry, I said that was last point, this is related to it, which is that if you're in the market and you have that information, you can decide you disagree with it. You can decide actually you don't think government's going to follow through with this policy or they'll do more. You can decide that actually we're on a path for 3 degrees and so it's not solving the bigger problem, so policy is going to tighten and people who've anticipated that are more attractive than those who are just playing with the status quo.
That helps, I understand.
Yeah.
One last question on this, and I'm getting close to wrapping up for people who are anxious, if they're anxious and back. You gave a speech in Amsterdam last week on climate, and there's a lot of very interesting lines to what you said, and I don't have time to pick through 3 or 4 or 5 of them in a sense. But one of the things that you said, and I think it's a line you said previously, is that too rapid a movement towards a low carbon economy could materially damage financial stability. So too rapid a movement toward a low carbon economy too. What does too rapid look like? What does that mean?
It's a great question. And we're actually doing some, I think that issue at the moment we're not that worried about in terms of a rapid acceleration of it. In part because from a financial perspective, by getting this, and that's part of the point, is to get this disclosure out in time so you make the adjustment and move around. But we're actually doing some research around those issues. Look, I think transitions towards the 2030, 2040 horizon can be well anticipated and are perfectly manageable. In the end, and I'll finish on this, from a financial perspective, for many institutions, these issues are not immediate short-term issues. They have short enough, their assets are short enough lived that the big manifestations of climate change will happen after the asset is, matured. But they have to position themselves for the relative value, I've made this more complicated, for the relative value change as these policies come in. And that's something that probably bites more into the next decade.
Okay. You meant too complicated for me, not for the audience, right?
Yeah. Okay. I think I might have made it too complicated for myself. I'm not sure I understood what I said. But
okay, last question, just go back to future work at the end.
That was
your term is up in 2019.
That was the last question.
At the bank.
Yes,
yeah.
yes,
back
correct.
to future work.
Correct. That was the last question.
The future of your work.
Yes, future of my work, I see.
So 2019, just a little more than a year away. What's the future look like for you?
I'm going to need a job. And I'm going to come back. I'm going to retrain. I'm going to come back. I'm going to have to retrain. That's what I know. That's going to be consistent. Thank you.
Mark, I don't want to do this out in public, but we are looking for Vice President of Policy at the Public Policy Forum.
Okay.
And we'll hold the job for a year. Okay?
Thank you very much. That's great.
Much.
Perfect. Thank you. That's great. Very good.